One voice standing tall, embracing change and justice in modern Australia. As a young Australian back in 1972, I participated in Gough Whitlam's historic sweep to victory. Labor was back from the wilderness. The political landscape in Australia was about to change. A new era had begun. We, the baby boomers, had cause for hope, and we were ready to take action on change. Many hearts were ready, willing and able to create a better world. My ancestors immigrated to Australia after earlier generations were dispossessed of their land during the Scottish clearances on the Isle of Skye in the mid-19th century. It was in my blood to recognise injustice and to stand up for the downtrodden. My family arrived in this country on a boat, fleeing poverty and injustice, their hearts hopeful for a better future. It was many years before I realised the genocidal cost of my family's freedom on the white Australians. Starting in my own backyard, I realised the need to acknowledge the Aboriginal people as the first Australians, the ancient custodians of this land that my family now called home. Like many of my generation, I was inspired by Dylan's heartfelt call to action for the times they are a-changing. I was brought up with the values of decency, honour, respect and justice in post-war Australia, and I knew in every fibre of my being that all people, irrespective of race, colour and religion, were equal. I was 7 years old when Aboriginal people were given the right to vote in 1962. This was followed by the Vote Yes referendum of 1967, where ordinary Australians resoundingly declared that Aborigines were not flora and fauna and would and must be counted in the census. The first Australians had finally been recognised as people. One small but significant step had been taken on the path of constitutional change. Like myself, most white Australians lived in the cities. We rarely, if at all, had contact with Aboriginal people. As a child, I was schooled in lies and kept ignorant of the true history of white Australia, the genocide, dispossession and racism, the invasion and injustice that Aboriginal people had suffered and continued to suffer to this day. My first awareness of their plight dawned slowly in 1972 while I was working in Brisbane at a state-run children's home. Here I met and cared for a family of Aboriginal children whose family never visited them. Knowing nothing of the Australian government policy of removal of children from their families, I inquired as to why they had no visitors. And I was told that these children were neglected, unwanted and abandoned. It was many years before I realised the truth. They had been forcibly removed from their parents by cruel government policies still in place in the early 70s. I visited these children for a few years, long after I left that job. And they were now at another government home, working as unpaid help for the duration of their childhood. Somewhere their mother, father, relatives and extended family grieved for their loss. They were members of the stolen generation, dispossessed of love, identity and land. Seemingly by chance, my next significant encounter with an Aboriginal person came in 1974 when I met and was welcomed by Udjuru Nunakul, a black rights activist and a poet, and I was welcomed onto her people's land on Stradbroke Island. She was and remains a revered elder of the Quandamooka people of Moreton Bay, and we spent an afternoon chatting at the Nunakul sitting down place while she educated me about the political struggle of her people and shared some of her history and poetry. I grieved with her the Aboriginal people's dispossession, and I stood shoulder to shoulder with her against the repressive regime of Bjelke Petersen in Queensland. And I remember to this day her pledge to educate and share her culture with all children. She stood proudly on her path of non-violent change. Udjuru's message took seed in my heart and grew strong roots. Many decades later, long after her passing, I visited Stradbroke Island again and stood a sister in spirit upon her land, to pay my respects and to honour her. In 1975, Gough Whitlam, in an act of restitution, lifted the banner of justice high and carried it forward on behalf of all Australians. He was the first Prime Minister to make reparation by redressing long-standing claims of the Wandjira people for the return of their land at Wave Hill. Standing on Wurundjeri country in the Northern Territory, Whitlam returned the dirt to the open palm of Elder Vincent Lingiari, declaring the restoration of the land forever to the Wandjira people. Under Aboriginal and Australian law, this promise was consecrated in the red dirt of Central Australia. The song "From Little Things, Big Things Grow" represents the flicker of hope, compassion and change that sprang to life that day. It wasn't until 1988 that the next Prime Minister became involved. The sacred vow known as the Barunga Statement was raised aloft by Prime Minister Bob Hawke that year when he promised to enshrine an Aboriginal treaty into Australian constitutional law. Later, this promise was blocked and violated by the Hawke government, some say in an act of unspeakable bastardry in favour of the mining magnates. Greed had won the day, justice trampled. Australia's heartland had been surrendered by the very Labor government who'd previously vowed to honour treaty. Tears of bitterness fell all over this country. Yothi singing for their people released Treaty, the song Treaty, in 1992. And singing with one voice, they reminded us all that the land was never surrendered. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. The winds of change blew strong in 1992 and the momentous Mabo case finally received justice in Australia's High Court. After decades of activism by Aboriginal people, it was acknowledged in law that Indigenous dispossession in Australia had occurred. The lie of terra nullius was routed. The door to land rights for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders was flung wide open. Eddie Mabo stood upon the shoulders of his elders. Sweet victory for all. He had seized the chance for justice and the long-awaited change began to flow. However, Australia's political landscape grew even more brittle, conservative and heartless under the leadership of John Howard and his Liberal Party in the late 1990s. Crushed in their callous grip, our hope for justice for Aboriginal people faltered and appeared to wither on the vine. The hopes and dreams of marginalised First Australians were trashed and buried under policies of paternalistic racism as more children were taken away. Many of us hung our heads in shame as Australian Aboriginals continued to live lives of poverty, injustice and neglect, in a land where their ancestors had thrived for more than 60,000 years. The heartlessness and racism evident in many of my fellow Australians now focused upon people seeking asylum in this country. Desperate people fleeing persecution and war were cast by the government as queue jumpers and incarcerated initially in the remote desert country and then later on islands far out to sea. We had before us an opportunity to redress some of our national history of genocide. Instead, we closed our ears, sealed our hearts and turned our backs, out of sight and out of mind. Just as the Aboriginal people had bitterly learned, so asylum seekers came to realise that the hearts of many Australian politicians and indeed the general populace were hardened by greed and fear. My faith in my fellow Australians was devastated. These policies continue today to the great shame of us all. After the long wintry decade of shame, the Bringing Them Home report galvanised action from newly elected Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. He vowed on the 13th of February 2008 to turn a new page in our relationship with the Aboriginal people. On behalf of us all, he apologised. We apologise for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering and loss on these, our fellow Australians. We apologise especially for the removal of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families, their communities and their country. For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind, we say sorry. To the mothers and the fathers, the brothers and the sisters, for the breaking up of families and communities, we say sorry. And for the indignity and degradation thus inflicted on a proud people and a proud culture, we say sorry. As a nation and a country, an opportunity to embrace the apology lay before us. All over Australia, people wept. The path to collective healing called us. The opportunity to act decisively to close the gap and enshrine in law a binding treaty lay before our people, Parliament. They failed to act. Later that year, in 2008, an angelic voice reached out through the radio airways, lifting my heart and soul. This was Jeffrey Gurumul Yunupingu. Sharing his language and spirit, he captured my heart and the hearts of millions worldwide. A Yolngu man from Elcho Island, he stood strong and proud as an ambassador for his people. As previous frontman for Yothi Indi, his voice fanned the fires of change. He sang in Galpu, Gamaji and Dimbarapunagu language, songs of healing, forgiveness and love of country and family. As a strong, proud, courageous Gamaji man, he stood as a mentor for his people for generations to come. We were forever changed by his song as we took him into our hearts. The winds of change, though not always comfortable, continue to swirl cyclone-like around modern Australia. We proudly call ourselves a multicultural nation, and yet this identity is paper thin. It is tarnished by our failure to honour treaty. It is tarnished by our celebration of Australia Day, a day of mourning for the First Nation people. It is tarnished by the rate of incarceration and death of young Aboriginal men. It is tarnished by the inhumane mistreatment of those coming to our shores fleeing war and persecution. Growth and change require courage, conviction, determination, and an abiding will to stand up and speak out for justice today. In modern Australia, less than 3% of Australians are Aboriginal, yet their voices resound loudly and decisively through the corridors of power. 2017 marked 50 years since Aboriginal people were counted in the census. Then they were counted, now they wish to be heard. The traditional elders of more than 500 nations of Indigenous Australia gathered in the lead up to Sorry Day on the 26th of May 2017. They came to the Central Desert heartland at Mutijulu and sat in the shadow of Uluru, the spiritual home of this nation. Out of this historic convergence was birthed the Uluru Statement of the Heart. They declared with one voice that their spiritual connection to this land is ancient and has never been extinguished, despite more than 200 years of oppression and dispossession. Their clarion call emerged loud and clear on the winds of change. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds and their culture will be a gift to this country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. So stated the Uluru Statement of the Heart. Music's the door to my heart, and I acknowledge the galvanising power of song and music through the hearts of such greats as Jimmy Little, Ruby Hunter, Yothi Indy, Christine Anu, Dan Sultan, Xavier Rudd and many others of the Indigenous tradition who have sung and continued to share the spirit of their people. Especially I acknowledge Archie Roach for his work of loving reconciliation through song, and Gurumul as the voice of his people's Dreamtime spirit. This is a momentous week, as this week the Victorian Government have declared the path to treaty is alive and well in this state, and they will pursue it. And similarly, the Northern Territory Government have reopened the talks of Burunga and treaty. I salute these governments. I raise my voice and call to my fellow Australians. Let us seize the moment and become the voice of change. I open my heart to all Australians and invite you to become an instrument for change in this country. Let's add our voices to the voice of the first Australians. Let our strength be their strength. Our voice, their voice. Our heart, their heart. Let us stand together and speak with one voice, one heart, and then the door to love will open wide and justice will be seen.